run through of the business meeting. So here is the listing of the 2022 to 2023 TIG leadership. I'm Cheryl Andrus. I am the chair. Joining us today, we have Marcella. I'm going to give a wave, Marcella. Chris is here. She's the past chair, and Anne Marie is here. And then Maria, I believe, will be joining us later. And we also have a webmaster who is Bara Basfar. Yes. And our at-large members, that are Tom Archibald, we're lucky enough to have him as an at-large member for our group. Sally Bond, Montana is also with us today. Mona Lisa Xian and Keiko Kuji Shikitani are also at-large members. And we meet monthly, which I'll talk about here in a second, and just work through things for the TIG. So here's just a quick update on what we've done in 2022. We had 2 webinars. Marcella has been organizing those for us, and we plan to expand offerings to bi-monthly sessions in 2023. So we're going to be mining the proposals that our TIG received for some options for webinar presenters. So you may be contacted if you submitted a proposal that didn't get into the actual conference. Don't despair, we may be in contact with you. Our TIG received 65 proposals and 56 members were served as reviewers. Of the 65 proposals, 24 sessions were accepted for inclusion in the program. Here's a quick snapshot of some of our sessions that we have that we think are pretty exciting, that we would hope you would join us for if you're going to be at the conference. Reshaping evaluation to embed a practice of learning is a panel session. We have a skill building workshop, playing with uncertainty, leaning into improv for effective evaluation practice. I believe that one will be participatory. And then there's a think tank that sounds pretty exciting, reimagining the evaluator role, centering racial equity into capacity building. I have put a spreadsheet with the list of all the sessions at that link there. I'll post it in the chat in just a few minutes as well. So what's next? For 2023, we're going to be having elections for the program co-chair. Our TIG moves people up to maintain continuity and institutional memory. So people move from the program chair positions into the chair positions, and then those of us who have been chair rotate out into the past chair, which is what Chris is occupying that space for us right now. But we also have other options for engagement. We'd love to expand our ongoing engagement. We have ideas for newsletters. We have webinars that we want to do. We're interested in starting to do some coffee breaks. We need some people to help with curating or contributing to the AEA 365. Our week is going to be in March, and other ideas yet to be discovered. So in other words, we need you. So if you're interested, you can contact myself or Marcella, and our emails are here, but they're also on the TIG webpage on the AEA site. Our monthly TIG leadership meetings are open to anyone who wants to join us. We meet on the third Thursday of the month from 5 to 6 Eastern time. And we're also always adding things to our webpage, resources, and etc. So please check that out when you have chance. So I'm going to just do a quick overview. We're going to be turning it over to our illustrious conversationalists, as I said, Hallie Preskill and Tom Archibald. Just in case you're not familiar with their work, here is just a small representation, and then they'll do self-introductions as soon as I hand it over to them. Hallie has authored several books indicated here, and then Tom has been doing a lot of work recently on evaluative thinking and ethical evaluation practice. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tom and Hallie.
Hi, everyone. Tom, you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Thanks, Hallie. And thank you all for being here. We're so glad to have you. See some familiar faces and some new faces. And for me, it's a great honor to have this chance to chat about ECB, and particularly with Hallie Preskill. And I think with this size group, we'll be able to really make it a dialogue between all of us. So get ready to to hop on in. Really briefly, I'm joining you from lands traditionally cared for by the Tutelo and Monacan people, currently called Blacksburg, Virginia, where I'm an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural Leadership and Community Education at Virginia Tech. I've long been passionate about ECB and AEA in general, although relative to the conversation as folks for logging in, I've only been going since 2008, so I'm a relative newbie. And I'm currently serving on the board of AEA, and also had the honor of working with Veronica Lazabal on this year's theme a little bit, which I'm really excited about. So I hope many of you will be able to join us in person in New Orleans here shortly. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all and very much looking forward to this conversation. So thanks.
So Tom, you know, one of the reasons you haven't written as many books or whatever is because you're a lot younger. And so clearly you're on your way to having a significant influence on the field. So thank you. And thank you, TIG leadership, for inviting me to this conversation. I'm at the tail end of my career. And so it's really fun to kind of think about some of these issues. I spent 22 years as an academic and teaching graduate level courses in evaluation, research, adult learning, organizational learning, appreciative inquiry, consulting, human resource development, training, design, and delivery. And so, and during that period, of course, I got to research and write, and that's where I did most of my writing, I would say my academic writing. And then I left academia 13 years ago to join a nonprofit research and evaluation strategy consulting firm, where I was a managing director there and developed a strategic learning and evaluation practice. And I can say I honestly learned probably more in my, well, I was there for 12 years, 12 years at FSG, than probably my 22 years of academic teaching, because I had to actually do the work and I had to learn lots of things. And most of that work has been in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector for the last 12 years. I left FSG a year and a half ago and now am working less and enjoying life, that balance, as an independent evaluation and learning advisor consultant. So ECB, just so and organizational learning are the two topics that I think have guided or been threads throughout my career. I think I was involved in setting up the TIG a number of years ago. Can't remember when it all started, but I remember it's kind of like a petition and the board and all that kind of stuff. Because I've always thought of evaluation as a means for facilitating individual, group, organization, and community learning. And because I started out as a teacher and then as an academic and now and did lots of training, I think that's been a thread. And so this topic is near and dear to my heart. And I've always believed that evaluation is a force for changing organizations or learning in organizations. So sorry, Tom, that was longer than yours, but I'm older again, you know. So.
No apologies needed.
It's like, okay, so should we chat?
Sure. And thanks for the vote of confidence that I still have some, hopefully many contributions ahead of me, and
Yeah.
I'm excited. As we were all thinking about this chat, as with the TIG leadership, one thing that kind of rose to the top of the conversation was the state of the field, where we've been, where we're going. And by field here, we mean ECB or OL-ECB. And we can talk a little bit about the distinction and the balance between those two, separated by a hyphen in this TIG. And then we want to think a little bit about where we might be going in the sort of subfield of evaluation capacity building. And we found ourselves continuously referring to the famous Preskel and Boyle 2008 model. So Cheryl has kindly just shared a link in the chat, which will take you to a Google slide with that framework from the 2008 article. Hallie, I forget, I'm not sure if I mentioned this when we were chatting earlier, but 2008 is actually the year, not only the year that I started in evaluation, but it's the year I started grad school. It's the year I learned what evaluation was, let alone what ECB was. And I started on an evaluation capacity building project working with Bill Trosham and So I probably encountered this right when it was published. And it has been so instrumental in my ECB practice and thinking about research on ECB as well. And it just so happened that today in my evaluation class, the topic was ECB. So I assigned this paper still, and the students were providing some feedback. And in that spirit of feedback, we'd like to start this conversation, Hallie, by having you reflect back on this 2008 model and with what you've seen and experienced in the years that have ensued, what, if anything, would you like to change or update with the model, just as a starting point for the conversation?
Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks, Tom. You know, I think it's important for me to acknowledge the truth that ECB started being talked about in 05, 06. I think I remember it was Stockdale and Bazerman, and there were some articles that were starting to define it and talk about the importance of it. And I thought that was great. So what happened with this model is, like, I actually got an opportunity to get a grant to do some research. And the program officer from the Irvine Foundation at the time said, you know, what are you working on? And I said, well, I really want to study the link between evaluation capacity building and organizational learning. And how is it happening? And what are people doing in ECB? And kind of further define it and really see how it's being implemented in organizations and so on. And so that research project resulted in this model. And I'm sometimes hesitant to call it a model. I rather really think of it as a framework for thinking about it so that it can be operationalized in practice. As I looked at this again, I have to be honest, I haven't looked at it for a while. It's not up on my wall or anything like that. I want maybe just a few comments about some reflections that I've had. My overall one was like, I think I still like it. I think it still holds some weight, or I mean, it still makes sense to me. Which was like, because I hate reading my work. After I finish a book or an article, I can't reread it because I will find lots of problems with it. This, I think, still holds up, but I invite critique. But this is not about the model, the whole conversation, but more about the field, as Tom said. I think two small tweaks, one big tweak. On the left side, I want to say this was not about competencies or content of ECB. That's something that's important to name. We weren't trying to say these are all the things people should learn. Although in the article we do articulate, or the second article we do articulate, we saw some objectives. But in terms of the framework itself, it was agnostic to what's being taught or what people are learning and what the competencies are. So that's other work was being done by King and Stevan and others around that. And really we want to just think about what does good ECB look like? And so the two little tweaks I would say, I think with internship, I would also add apprenticeship, because over the years, I've seen more people learn about evaluation through, I'm calling it like on-the-job training. Maybe that's a better term for it, because it's not formal apprenticeship. So there are some, I suppose, through maybe the JEDI program and some other DEI initiatives. So I think apprenticeship adds another element of ways that people learn, maybe on-the-job training too, but I'm a little less likely to put that on there because it sounds a little bit serendipitous, and I'd like ECB a little bit more intentional and purposeful, but that's maybe semantics. The other small tweak, and Tom, you're going to love this one because you may want to debate. In our pre-conversation to this chat today, Tom made the distinction between teaching as not being an ECB strategy. And I think I would add, you know, I thought I agreed with you, and then I started thinking more, and I'm not sure. So I would say training and teaching in the circle. I think teaching is an ECB strategy. So those would be my two small tweaks. The big one for me is less of an, I don't know the answer to it, but I think given the where we are today, my question is, where does DEI fit in? And how the ways in which we build capacity and for whom where would DEI show up in this? And clearly it would be content, but are there influences or things we need to think about in the design of experiences in ECB that need to adopt an equity lens? So I don't have like examples I'm going to give you right now, but I think that's important to consider. Where is the equity DEI kind of lens or inclusion of approach in the way we design and implement ECB activities? In terms of, so I think other than that, the left side kind of holds, if you will. I think in the middle, what I was trying to show in the middle is that people learn and then they apply, the intention is they apply their learning in their organization or community setting. And so that's the transfer of learning. And there's a lot written on the transfer of learning in the adult learning literature and training literature. I'm not going to go into that. But I think the 4 elements there came out of my research prior to this work on organizational learning and the development of the readiness for organizational learning and evaluation instrument. And those are the categories there. And I still think those, what's here is the organizational learning context. That information from ECB still doesn't get transferred unless there's a context for that transference to occur.
The 5-minute light.
So I think I still like this piece here, but I would add also a DEI question around here. What is it in the organizational context around diversity, equity, inclusion that needs to be considered in supporting transfer of learning?
You got to move up. Oh my God.
And then on the right side, the only tweak I would make at this, a couple tweaks maybe, but one is in the center bubble, we want to emphasize continuous learning about evaluation. I want to change that language to embedded learning practices. So it's not just continuous, it's kind of, to me, that's too fluffy, but we're talking more now embedding learning into the ways people do their work all the time. And part of that's your evaluative thinking work. I think it's part of that. So I would definitely kind of hone some of the language there. So I think that in terms of, I have lots of things about like what should be researched and where it might be going in the future, perhaps some thoughts about that. But I think as a set of variables, they still make sense to me. But I invite anyone, including yourself, of course, to say, I would tear the whole thing up and start again.
Well, that's great and very helpful. And I think, first of all, I'm right there with you that I think it still holds, which is really impressive. You know, models, frameworks, what have you, tend to come and go. And there's been some other ones that have been added on from different perspectives. You know, Cousins and some of his colleagues sort of made that schematic diagram with adding some interesting pieces, approaching it from a different perspective.
Right.
And then Sue Labin and others sort of with Wandersman kind of made that logic model of how to do ECB, again, a different perspective. So they're just doing different things. For me,
Tom, can I interrupt 1 second? I just saw one of the questions somebody said, Marcella said, would you add mentoring of evaluation of the framework? Yeah, mentoring. That's a great add. Another technique. Sorry.
Yeah, it's strange that it's not in there. I always just assumed it was in there. But then you look closely and you're like, oh, it's not there.
And I can't remember why. So it was a long time ago. Sorry, continue.
So for me, it really sticks and works. And I love everything you said, you know, particularly around DEI and how it needs to be embedded both as a content area that's focused on within ECB, as well as a part of the process of how ECB is done. So I think that's an area, and I think Mike chimed in the chat then that some folks next week at the conference will be addressing that lens. And so Mike, maybe in a second you can come off mute and talk a little bit about that. But also just really quickly, one of the sessions that Cheryl mentioned at the outset was on the role of it was called the role of the evaluator, reimagining the evaluator role, centering racial equity in capacity building. And that's a panel chaired by Hillary Loeb. And also one of my colleagues, Natalie Cook, who's at Virginia Tech, she did her dissertation on what she called basically transformative evaluation capacity building, which was one lens of doing that as well. Mike, are you presenting on that next week, or are there folks you're looking to hear from?
To this model, but I know that a lot of people, a panel that my work is on, they are referring to this, although I don't know if they're going to expand so specifically on the model itself. But I'm imagining that a lot of folks will be talking about.
Oh yeah, certainly, and hopefully adding the DEI part as well.
Okay, so I'm gonna chime in here because I want to ask you a question, Tom.
Okay.
Because the session's not about critiquing the model. We thought that'd be a good, and I know we thought that'd be a good place to start as a jumping off. But, you know, I've been out of academia for a lot. I do read, but I'm not doing research. And so my question for you, Tom, to the best that you can, it's like, what's new? You know, what are people writing about? What is, and obviously some of the sessions at EA give us a clue. I looked at all the titles, and I do think there's a lot of equity language embedded in some of those titles and presentations. But where you know, where do you think the field has come over the last, you know, 14 years?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. And I do think, you know, more diversity, equity, inclusion in ECB is one of the big trends. There's a lot of exciting, and hopefully not a trend. It doesn't sound even right to call it a trend, but an approach, a framing that's time is long past due, and it's good to see it finally coming into the research on ECB space. Two or three other new directions, or at least new to me when I encountered them. One of them you actually touched on earlier by mentioning competencies, and how competencies were not part of what you did in this original article. But Anne-Marie Kesselman, who's actually with us in TIG leadership and working on her dissertation on ECB, is looking at ECB competencies. And for me, I think that's really refreshing and an innovative new direction for the subfield of ECB, because of course we are all very familiar with the evaluator competency conversations in Canada, in the US, in other contexts as well. But ECB is so popular, we tend to be one of the TIGs with the highest membership. A lot of people who maybe don't even fully have an identity as an evaluator are engaged in ECB, whether they're an internal evaluator. Like I love a lot of you know, Boris Volkov's writing about what internal evaluators do with a sort of ECB function. There's, you know, plenty of people who are doing it who don't even know that AEA exists. So Anne-Marie is doing research on the competencies specific to being what I call an ECBer or an ECB practitioner. And so part of that research, and maybe Anne, if you don't mind, I don't know if you knew we were going to put you on the spot, but to share that my thesis in you know, 20 seconds. But part of that work is also establishing being an ECBer as a viable professional identity that you know, you might do a little evaluation, and probably a lot of the people on this call, a good portion of their professional practice is supporting the evaluation capacity of organizations. And so competencies for ECB is one area. Anne-Marie, do you want to just add a little bit of what your exciting findings are, maybe?
Sure. Sure. I did find that there were some overlaps and similarities, as might be expected, with competencies for evaluators. But some of the two things that come to mind in terms of what kind of differentiates an ECBer is applying the principles of adult learning and applying knowledge of organizational change and development. So I think something of interest to this TIG for sure. Those are kind of the two things that kind of make us unique as ECBers.
That is great. Thanks, Anne-Marie. And Hallie, that's music to her ears, I'm sure, because I mean, I've often felt that even this TIG neglects the organizational learning side. I myself, I'm not as well steeped in that literature as I am in the ECB literature. So I know I have so much to learn from, you know, all the amazing work on organizational learning, which is where Hallie's been, you know, you've been more active in a lot, especially with FSG and other groups. So yeah, any quick reaction to that, Hallie, before I move to the next new trend?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember why ECB and OL were combined when the TIG formed. But no, that's no, it is music to my ears. I'm very much interested in thinking about what are the competencies people. So when you said the competencies that people who are learning evaluation need to have, or the facilitators of ECB?
The facilitators, the ECB.
Facilitators.
The
Okay,
ECB,
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Good luck. Can't wait to see it.
Yeah. And I think, Anne-Marie, there's probably even, I mean, relationality, the interpersonal factor, which Lori and Jean wrote about as well in their wonderful book. You know, you need that for evaluation, and you need it times 10 to do ECB. the ability to go into an organization and sense their needs, sense their culture, understand what's going on, and then pitch evaluation to them in a way that even the people who, when they meet you the first day, tell you to your face that they hate evaluation, by the end of a few sessions are saying, wow, if this is what it is, I'm actually really into it. I didn't know this is what it was. So but it's that relationality, I think, that helps people get people there. Yeah, Sarah's like guiding light is to have people have that aha moment, and she does it all the time. So
Great.
Another area that it just when research on ECB that I thought, oh, this is an exciting new direction, was Hind Al-Hudib's study on the intersection of evaluation policy with ECB, which she worked on with Brad Cousins. She did her dissertation on that and has published on it 1 or 2 articles. And that actually, I know we're not just focusing on the framework, Hallie, but my students today, at least one of whom, Samson, is here with us today. We spend a lot of time talking about the eggs or the bubbles in the right-hand side, and really realizing that while those are all appropriately there, a couple things. Some of them are not that well fleshed out. Like, we don't necessarily know, like, what does an integrated knowledge management evaluation system look like? What does the strategic plan for evaluation look like? Which organizations have a strategic plan for evaluation? I think there's a few foundations out there that have them, because the foundations are often at the leading edge. But then, and then also, even if they are, like, everybody knows what an evaluation policy is, but there's like dozens of dissertations waiting to happen about, like, okay, what is the relationship between evaluation policy and ECB? So Hind has done that, but there's others in there. So I think that was really exciting that she carved that out as a innovative research on evaluation or research on ECB topic.
That's great.
But I'm sure FSG had a strategic plan for evaluation when you were.
No. So FSG, I was doing this work before FSG. So yes. But what I was going to say, I smiled because when I was looking at the bubbles of evaluation frameworks and processes and strategic plan. Well, before I got to FSG, but then we fleshed it out more. The work we were doing with that is strategic learning and evaluation system. We call it a SLES, and strategic learning and evaluations, and it's a system, not just a framework. So it starts with like an evaluation vision. It goes into evaluation learning vision. Then it goes into what's the strategy or strategies and how are they implemented. Maybe doing some systems mapping, developing theories of change, looking at grantee reporting if it's a philanthropic organization, then developing what are the evaluation plans, what kind of evaluations are needed, what's needed for monitoring and research in the organization. And then, what it adds leadership on. What are the roles of leadership in supporting evaluation, communication? So it's more of an organization system of a strategy. I've called it a strategy for evaluation and learning in an organization. So those have been fleshed out, certainly over the years in my own practice, and most of that while at FSG. So I think also I was just want to say, the word coaching, I was thinking about it. Coaching, I think, should be on the left side too.
Yes.
And there's a difference in definition between mentoring and coaching that we don't need to go into. But what I'm doing a lot of now, my ECB work is mostly coaching. And, I'm not doing workshops, but I'm working with individuals or small groups, coaching them through developing knowledge and skills around how to do various aspects of evaluation. So I think a lot of people are doing coaching around evaluation. So I think it's a little to the ECB strategy. But that's really interesting about the evaluation and policy. I'm not sure what it's going to look like, but I look forward to that.
Yeah, and one of the sort of specific areas that even my students were asking about today was in terms of, and it's another bubble on that same right-hand side, but in terms of resource allocation for ECB, because it all goes together, right? Like an agency that has a strategic learning plan is more likely to say, you know what, in our annual professional development budget, we're going to bring in so-and-so to do a workshop on this topic or this topic.
Right.
So, the reason that made me think of that is because that was one of the findings from Hind's dissertation, was that she was actually looking at bilateral and multilateral funding agencies more so than implementing partners, but what were their policies around the ECB of their essentially grantees, which is something a foundation could do.
Right.
I love that you teased out the subtle differences between Now, first of all, internships and apprenticeships, and then also coaching and mentoring. And coaching, you know, we don't talk too much in this TIG about developmental evaluation, but I know there's probably people here on the call who are developmental evaluation practitioners, right? And that you know, when you're doing developmental evaluation, you're more of a coach than an evaluator because you're helping the organization along. So of course there's ECB, process use, all in spades. One third, this is not really a new direction in research, but it's a new exciting development in the ECB subfield. And I'm very glad that Leslie Fierro just hopped on because it pertains to her. For the first ever ECB case competition, probably some of you don't know about this yet. It's going to be happening, hosted at McGill University, where Leslie is now, in the Max Bell School of Public Policy. So Leslie can tell us more about that, but it's supported by a donation as well as the Evaluation Capacity Network at the University of Alberta. And it's just getting up and running, but like probably many of you have heard about the evaluation case competitions. It's a global thing, very, very big in Canada. But now we're going to have one for young ECBers. So Leslie, do you mind just sharing us a little bit more about what we can expect from the ECB case competition?
Oh, I'd love to tell you. Thanks, Tom.
And she didn't pay me to say this. This was completely spontaneous.
Yay. Yeah, so we are going to be hosting an ECB case competition. It'll be towards the end of April 28th and 29th. And what we're doing is right now we're recruiting applications from organizations who might like to serve as a case site for the case competition. So they'll be completing some information in the application about their current evaluation capacity and things that they are feeling challenged with in terms of their evaluation capacity and what they kind of would like to envision for evaluation within their organization. And then we'll be at AEA announcing the application process for students and recent graduates to apply to be considered as a team member. And we'll be reviewing those, and people can apply from the US or Canada. And excuse me, and they can be from any discipline, right? So the only real requirement is that they've had like one intro program evaluation course, and that could be a university course or it could be a professional development workshop. And the people who are selected will receive 6 weeks, like kind of 6 trainings virtually over the course of 6 weeks. They'll be teamed up with a coach, all people who know about evaluation capacity building. And then we'll introduce the challenge on the 28th, and the teams will part ways for 24 hours and work on coming up with a either a product or a strategy for, you know, addressing the question that was raised by the case site organization around evaluation capacity. So it could be anything from, you know, how do we create evaluations that are more aligned with our values of our organization, right? Or how do we create an environment in which we're learning across evaluations, right, that are produced in our organization, so we can harness kind of the collective wisdom across all of these different evaluations. So yeah, so this is, you know, we knew that the Canadian Evaluation Society case competition was out there. It looks like AEA is also creating a case competition where people develop evaluation plans. But we thought, well, there's a gap here for evaluation capacity building. So why not teach people about this or more about it and have a case competition, have some fun with it.
That's great. Best of luck with that. That's exciting.
We'll see how it goes.
It's really, really cool. And it touches on competencies like Anne-Marie's work. It touches on this identity as an ECBer, that so current students and recent graduates can really own that identity. And I think those are really important new directions for the subfield of ECB, and then for evaluation writ large. And Leslie, Tanya's asking where one can apply as a case site. Is there a link for that, or they just email you?
There is a link. I will put it in the chat.
Wonderful. Excellent. Well, so now we want to turn a little bit to, you know, okay, so these are some trends. Just what other what other trends or upcoming challenges do we anticipate, do we see, and where do we want the subfield of ECB to be in 5 or 10 years? I'll just quickly mention a few and then turn it over to Hallie. You know, Hallie mentioned, and so not to start from a deficit-based model, because I think most of us ECBers appreciate appreciative inquiry, like Hallie has worked on, as well as Tessie Katsambas. But Hallie mentioned that the framework came out of funding to do ECB. I was telling my students, much to their shock today, that my entire assistantship was supported by the National Science Foundation for an ECB project, where Bill Trosham as the PI. You know, those are hard to come by, either a foundation or a federal funding agency that is, because fundamentally they're interested in evaluation, but if they see it in such a way that they're willing to fund ECB, I mean, it's hard enough to get funding for research on evaluation, which I think that TIG is meeting it right now as well, the ROE TIG. But then funding, not just for research on evaluation, but for research on ECB, it can seem a bit esoteric to some funding agencies, but I think we need more of that, more understanding of the overlap of organizational learning and ECB. I'm totally interested in that. Of course, those who know me know that I'm still not tired of the concept of evaluative thinking. I think there's still more directions we can push that in and see sort of where that pops up. And then, you know, we were chatting earlier, Hallie, too, about, and you mentioned this in your earlier remarks, the relationship between evaluator education or education in a more formal sense and ECB. And that's something that TIG has talked about a bit. We're just wrapping up editing a new directions for evaluation on evaluator education. And we had to make the hard choice of really not focusing very much on ECB, but focusing a lot more on formal post-secondary higher education contexts. Of course, there's been a number of excellent NDE volumes on ECB over the years, and there hasn't been one on evaluator education for quite some years. So we're doing that with John Lavelle and Aisha Boyce and Leah Neubauer, thanks to our editors-in-chief, Leslie and Todd Frankie as well. We're wrapping up their tenure soon. But that's something, like, Hallie, I'd be interested, you know, when you were teaching evaluation, was it categorically different than when you were running ECB workshops for community agencies? And if so, how and why?
Not really. I mean, I've done over 500 workshops in my life, and it's just like the audience is different, the content you modify. But actually, I rather, like, to me, I'm really interested in where you started from, Tom. And you know, in terms of challenges, again, I've been working with foundations and nonprofits for the last 12 years, 13 years. And I would say the #1 barrier to the transfer of learning is leadership. And I knew it when I started this work. It's been a theme. It's been a thorn in my side, that and boards, but we won't go into the boards thing. But leadership within organizations is a significant barrier because they don't understand it. They don't have time for it. If they talk, they don't walk the talk. And so I can give you hundreds of examples, not hundreds, scores of examples of organizations where people are excited about evaluation. They're learning about it through these various techniques and strategies. And yet the organization conditions, as you know, dictated by leadership or not, create really difficult environmental concerns about transfer of learning. So I think one of the questions I have is, what can we do with leadership to build their evaluation capacity? I haven't seen a whole lot on that. So I would love to see some research, some practice, some tools, some thinking around how do we get leadership to move. And by leadership, I mean, it doesn't have to be like CEOs for sure, and presidents, EDs, but also, you know, vice presidents or program directors or people who are not, you know, who are managing other people, who have control the purse strings and really have an influence whether or not evaluation is going to be sticky and whether it's going to be embedded in the organization's practices. So, so I think that whole leadership piece is always on my mind, which seems to influence a lot. Culture influences a lot of things. I would love to see more research on those bubbles. You know, can we find examples of organizations that are creating these conditions, that are creating cultures of learning through evaluation and monitoring and learning. What do they look like? How do they get there? Case studies probably would be the most thing I'm interested in. Like, really, what does it take? What does it take to get an organization to embrace this work? And that's the org learning piece, of course. I think I'd love to know on the left side is like, what works well? Which of these strategies for which kinds of audiences? What does it need to, one training program, we all know people are going to, we know about knowledge and skill decay through the transfer of learning literature. What does it take for people to actually become evaluators, little e's, not necessarily professional evaluators, but to be able to support and carry out and lead evaluation work. So I think I'd love to see some research on which of these seem to be, or which in combination. And I know some people have done some studies over the years, but I think there's more to dig into there. There's been several readiness for ECB and org learning tools or inventories or surveys that have been developed. Maybe I just haven't been reading enough, but what do we learn from using those in multiple sites? And they're all good. They're variations on, the theme, if you will. And I'm not interested in what's the best one, but what are we learning when we assess these organizations' readiness for this work? I'd love to see some kind of, I don't know if it's a meta-analysis, and I don't mean a statistical analysis necessarily, though it could be, but more like some real intelligent thinking around what are we learning from these instruments. And then of course the DEI context that I mentioned, like what does it mean to embed equitable evaluation practices in DEI, in the ECB practices. Again, not the content, but the approach, the lens, the framing, et cetera. So I think those are a few things. I'm excited to hear you say that you think it's growing and that people are more interested. I do think the last thing I'll say is, because I work with philanthropy, I think philanthropy continues to devalue the importance of building their grantees' evaluation capacity. I think every grant should have a bucket of money to add with support, like ideas of how to build their grantees' capacity for the grantees' sake, not just to report data to the foundation. But I would love to see a lot more money filtered that way with some real, qualified ECB support of those things. So I'll stop there. Just a few things.
Well, I love that. And, like I know Samson, for instance, he's still forming his dissertation topic. So I'm sure he's furiously taking notes because there's like 10 dissertations in there. And it's so coincidental. Some of what you're talking about, we talked about today in class, and I want to loop back around to that in a second. In addition to that great idea of foundations needing to support ECB of their grantees, two quick things on that. One of our most recent series of webinars that Marcella pulled together through the TIG was actually foundations, but shining the ECB light internally, very nicely called, time for a selfie. And I think that may have some inroads into the leadership question, because what is it about those foundations and their leaders that are like, you know what, we need to do this on ourselves, with ourselves, in addition to not just our grantees. But then a parallel track that I always think about, like whenever I hear Kathy Newcomer or Nick Hart talking about the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, there's a huge ramp up in the amount of learning that's supposed to be happening at the federal government in the US since 2018 or whenever that was passed. Every agency is supposed to have a chief learning officer now. Who are they? What do they know about evaluation in ECB? And what ECB do their staff need in order to be in a functioning learning ecosystem?
You just hit my button. I'm seeing so many apologies to foundation people. I don't mean to offend you, but I keep seeing foundations hire people for evaluation positions that have no evaluation experience, and I'm having trouble with that.
That's a nice way to put it. Yeah,
I'm just having trouble with that because I see the challenges those folks face. It's not fair to them, but also it's not really supporting learning and evaluation. And they get hired. They're good people, but they have other skill sets that aren't necessarily well suited. I'm sorry, Tom, that was one of my hot
Yeah,
buttons.
but that's a great point. And I think, generally as an association, we're trying to be sure that people at least know about us, know about our offerings for professional development and graduate programs. That yeah, no, I love all that. Leadership, absolutely. One of my students today asked, where are the organizations that do value this? And the ones that I know of, it's very there's a strong sort of positive selection bias because they're the ones I know about because they brought me in to do an evaluative thinking workshop. So it was like a few Catholic Relief Services country programs. It was the Duke Endowment in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's the Templeton Foundation. IDRC, right, was like, I know they've kind of changed, but they were the first to do a case study on themselves about mainstreaming evaluative thinking, basically, by totally changing their report structure.
Yeah.
With Fred and Sarah Earle and others. So there's some good questions in the chat.
Yeah. So
including
Tom,
one from, yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
if you wanted to ask, there's one right there about Dr. Preskill. You mentioned something about a difference between framework and model. And I was wondering if you can repeat that distinction and whether you think the distinction applies to organizational leadership and ECB. And for example, is OL more of a framework and ECB more of a family of models? And how does the distinction affect ROE and or practices? And then there's one.
You better stop there first. There's a lot there. Thanks, Fung.
I mean, I think the thing I'd rather speak to is organizational learning is completely different literature discipline from evaluation capacity building. And so I want to say it's not about a framework or a model that's completely different. There's a whole body of knowledge around organizational learning as is there for the evaluation capacity building. I think I'm not pulling up the official definition between framework or model, but I think a model is more predictive that, you have to have these pieces in place and then you follow this and you get this. I think of the framework as kind of a tool, a guide, a framing of a topic or an issue or a practice that you don't have to do all of this to get some kind of results, but this is kind of like the ideal situation. And so you pick and choose what you think you can work on, knowing that this is like the ideal, but you're always approximating the ideal. So, and then Tom, there was something for you there too, I think. Right?
Yeah, Tom, it said, I was wondering about your thoughts, excuse me, on how OL-ECB can join forces with and rather than competing against continuous quality improvement CQI and dissemination specialists, et cetera, who also care about OL organizational learning.
Yeah, and I love, Fung, that you played around with the punctuation to join the OL and the ECB. Maybe the hyphen isn't doing it justice. It could be an ampersand or an @ a plus sign. Yeah. And it's a great question too. And Stan Capella, who's done 43 years of working with organizations in sort of the quality improvement and assurance area. I think that's why Stan is always present in ECB OL areas, because there's that overlap. And dissemination, I mean, that makes me, I think you might be referring to kind of even the whole burgeoning subfield of implementation science and all of that, where they are really thinking about how organizations learn. They do tend to be a little more rigidly positivist, post-positivist, and because they come from the health sciences, it's very strong emphasis on evidence-based programs and practices, but there's some really great work going on in that space too. And I think, long story short, it's just similar to how, for instance, AEA President Veronica Lazabal has for many years worked on casting a broader tent so that, for instance, in her work, the impact investing people who are ostensibly doing some evaluation can know about evaluation as a field, know about the theories and frameworks that we have, and say, hey, the ethical commitment that we have that they may want to be inspired by, and then can come in. And so we're doing that with this year's AEA conference. I think within our smaller subfield of ECB, we need to do the same thing with CQI and with implementation science and dissemination to say, hey, did you know that since 2008, we have the Preskill and Boyle framework? Because they love developing frameworks over in implementation science. There are a dime a dozen there. and they're good frameworks about knowledge translation. But like ECB and organizational learning have a lot to say about knowledge translation, as it were. And so I think we just need to keep building bridges and growing those relational connections, going to different conferences, and so that they know about us and we know about them. But yeah, great question, Fong. Thanks so much for that. And we're getting close on time. I mean, we could talk about OL and ECB for hours and hours and hours. Oh yeah, Leslie mentioned that with the new Evidence Act, all the agencies have to do an evaluation capacity assessment. Are they using one of the many scales that Hallie mentioned, or are they just doing it, however they want?
I don't know. I've been meaning to look into it and see what they're doing, but it sounds like they may be doing it a little bit differently across agencies, depending upon their needs.
Mm-hmm.
But don't quote me on that.
Okay, but once again, that's another study waiting to happen. And by the way, Hallie, I also love your idea of, so many people have used the readiness for organizational learning on evaluation, and also the ECAI since it's been published by, Suarez, Boxler, and Taylor Ritzler. Where are those studies or reports? What can we learn by looking across them about the factors that tend to land higher and lower, and why, or what types of organizations? That would be a fascinating study, because we're generating evidence and we're not leveraging it.
Exactly. Well, and whenever I did the role, and I've done the role many times over different organizations, the weakest two sections were either leadership or systems and structures. Consistently, those were the two, but mostly leadership. And of course, leadership always rates themselves higher than the rest of the staff. But across, and then so what, right? If that's the case, I'm interested in the so what. What does that all mean?
Right, for the transfer of learning and the embedding of learning. Yeah, absolutely. And I love we've sparked a good connection between Fung and Sarah, because with their shared passion for the overlap of ECB and CQI. So that's good too. I feel a future AEA presentation coming on, or AEA 360. So you two follow up after. Sarah, do you want to quickly come in and say anything about your understanding of the overlap between those two? No pressure if not, but yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Not really. Because I teach it to my students, and they get confused because CQI and evaluation use a lot of the same terminology, but they use them in different contexts and different applications. And so when I'm teaching graduate students who are taking a program evaluation course at the same time that they're teaching my CQI skills lab, they tend to get a little overwhelmed and muddled. And so I added a whole deck at the beginning of the semester to say these are related and complementary disciplines and skill sets and toolkits. I simplify it for them and say CQI can sometimes pick up where poorly implemented evaluation leaves off, right? Learning should be part of evaluation, dissemination, implementation, response, and action, that should all be part of evaluation. But when it's not, that's where CQI can step in. So that's how I explain it to my students. But when I'm doing my consulting work with my clients, I just respond to the needs that they present with, and I'm pulling from my different toolkits. And at the end of the project, I'm like, great, you just learned evaluation, you just learned CQI, you just learned process improvement. I just threw it all into a soup, and I call it evaluative thinking, and maybe Tom wouldn't approve. But I mix and match.
I'm not dogmatic, and you have, I'm learning from you every day about evaluative thinking, Sarah. So yeah. And another attendee has watched a webinar by you on CQI and evaluation. So, and Leslie, thanks for sharing those, pointing us towards the ECN, great resource for folks who are interested in this work. So absolutely, please follow up those links. And we're pretty much almost at time. Hallie, I think as the seasoned ECB, the wise ECB.
Just the old ECBer.
I didn't say old. Would you any last words of wisdom before I turn it back to the TIG leadership?
I just appreciate you all and your interest in the topic, and continuing to inquire into and share and be curious about and love evaluation and helping others share that love and joy and fear and no, I'm just kidding. So no, thank you. And if those of you going to the conference, have a great time. Thank you.
Thanks. And thanks for starting this TIG so we could all get together all these years later.
It wasn't only me, it was a bunch of us. I can't, it's so, what year was
I
it?
wonder, maybe was Jean in on it? I wonder.
Yeah, Gene King.
Yeah, probably. It feels like forever ago, but anyway.
We need a TIG historian too, an archivist. So we'll work on that.
I'm sure somebody could dig it out. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Cheryl, did you want to pick it up from here?
Yeah, I'll just let you know that we will be posting this recording on the AEA TIG webpage after it's ready to go, and to thank our presenters, communicators, conversationalists very much for joining us, and all of you for being so engaged. It was a great session and we really appreciate you all. And please find us at the conference. We hope to see you there.
Excellent
everyone.
business meeting. Excellent.
Thank
Okay,
you all.
take care, everybody. Stay healthy.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, Cheryl, are you still on?
Yeah.
So I recorded the chat.